Okay, so today we're going to start our second set of notes on classification. Today we're going to look at how scientists classify organisms according to their characteristics and how they decide what are the characteristics that are the most important. If you remember, our first notes was on Linné and the system he developed with the kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. And he grouped them according to external and internal characteristics and behaviors. So like if he would see a dolphin and he would say it has fins, it has a certain type of tail fin, it breathes through lungs, doesn't have gills, and birth to live young, and so on, has all these different characteristics, but it also swims and does other things, and it lives in the ocean. So he would take all those characteristics, and they would help him decide what group he went into, or the dolphin went into, and that's how he decided. But today they've started to look at more and different kind of ways, or different factors that determine what organism goes into what group. And today, much of the work, or much of the classification, is driven heavily by the work of Charles Darwin. Now, Charles Darwin came up with the idea of the origin of species, and that there was a common ancestor that gave rise to all the organisms on the earth. And a good way to look at that, or a way to look at that, is something called descent with modification. So an organism had all these certain characteristics. It changed gradually over time. It modified over time. And as you see here, that's what that said. That's what that says. Organisms gradually change over time. And this led to the use of phylogeny. And that is kind of like a branch of taxonomy or classification. And it's classification based on evolutionary relationships, more specifically common ancestors. So what common ancestors is talking about, if you have a mammal, or you have a squirrel, you have a squirrel that has certain characteristics, and one of those characteristics is fur. Okay? But you also have a salamander that has some of the same characteristics as the squirrel. So you might say, well, somehow maybe the squirrel and the salamander are related because they have similar characteristics. But then you say, well, the squirrel has fur, so there's no way they could be related. But using phylogeny, you might say, well, at one time they all had a common ancestor that had many of the same characteristics as the squirrel and the salamander. But then there arose a new ancestor that had fur, and that one's related to the squirrel. But they all had a common ancestor that had some of the similar traits that squirrels and salamanders share. Okay? So that's the common ancestor idea and the evolutionary relationship. Scientists then use something called a cladogram to show these relationships, or these connections between organisms. And I'm going to show you one here. This is one here, especially at the bottom here, kind of probably blocked with a picture of me with this text box. We'll come back and look at that. But this is a cladogram. So these lines show time. So this is, the bottom is the oldest time, and then as we move up this line, it comes closer and closer to where we are today. And then you can see here we have a lamprey, a shark, a salamander, a lizard, a tiger, a gorilla, and then a human. And there are characteristics that all of these have, every single one of these organisms, that they share. Okay? So using phylogeny, we would say, right back here, before all these changes, is a common ancestor of all these. Okay? Using Darwin's thinking on evolution or origin of species, common ancestor right here. But then there arose a new one. You see these jaws, lungs, amniotic membrane, hair, no tail, and bipedal. Each one of these represents a new ancestor that gave rise to this new trait. So for instance, lampreys do not have jaws. So there's a common ancestor here they all share, but then In time, there's a new organism that had jaws, that developed that. And then all these have jaws, so it gave rise to all these somehow. But it was after the lamprey, so the lamprey doesn't have jaws. Then we keep moving, lungs. So then there's another ancestor, a new trait of lungs, and it gave rise to all these organisms which have lungs, and so on. So eventually you get to this last organism. They would say it gave rise to humans. Okay? So that's kind of how a cladogram works. So you look at organisms and you say, what are some of the new characteristics that have arisen in those organisms over time? And then you can also do a text box here, and you can put ones in for the display of a new trait. Lampreys have none of them. Okay, they just share this common ancestor of all of them. But then sharks develop jaws, salamanders, this new traits. Until you get to the humans, they have all the traits here of a human that we would consider to be that genus and species. So that's kind of a cladogram. So if we go back to the notes, okay, so how do they come to that? Okay, so how do they make this cladogram? Okay, first of all, it still goes back to the work of Linné, which said morphology. So physical characteristics. So what do they have for organs? What do they have for external characteristics? What are some of their basic behaviors that they have? And let's group them with that first. And then let's look at DNA and RNA and genes. In the late 60s, really, Watson and Crick were able to construct the DNA molecule, and really it changed science. So once they understood the genetic molecule of life, DNA, they could then expand that and start to see how things are related. And so then they now use that today. And then with the advent of the computer and the ability to do fast calculations, they could then map the genome or the DNA of all the different organisms on the earth. And it's led to, because of that, it's led to looking at the similarities in DNA, RNA, and genes, and saying, well, if they have the same genes, maybe they're related. Or if they have the same DNA sequences, maybe they're related. Or if they have the same RNA sequences, maybe they're related. Okay, just like a child looks like their parents because they get their DNA from their parents, and we know this is true, then that common ancestor gave all the organisms its DNA, so maybe we can go back and analyze that and see how things are related. The last one is something called molecular clocks. Now, a molecular clock is kind of a different thing, and it's something new, just recently, and really becoming more accepted. And this is talking about mutations and in DNA. So if you're believing Darwin's idea that, and he based some of his work on Lyell and some other scientists, then you would believe the Earth is very old. And if you understand also the process of how DNA is replicated and how often that occurs, then you would realize that if organisms are really old, then mutations would accumulate over time. And then, so scientists started to ask themselves, well, maybe there's a regular rate at which this happens. So then they surmised that there was. So then they can try to date how old organisms are, where the common ancestors are, by that idea. But also with that, they can also say that if organisms are related or have a common ancestor, some of those changes would be similar among organisms with common ancestors. So then they look at the DNA and the mutations and say, if this has this many changes and this has this many changes, then perhaps they're related. Okay, and that's how they construct a cladogram. They look at the physical characteristics, analysis of DNA, RNA, and genes, and then they compare the rate of mutation or change in the DNA that has occurred. Okay, these are the three main. And that's really today, when you look at a cladogram, that's what you see, or that's what scientists have done. And then if you look back at this one here, this is really specific. It actually shows you the common ancestor that gave rise, that they suspect would give rise to these new organisms just based on the traits that they see. Okay, so that's kind of the notes. Hope you guys like this different format. You can give me feedback if you want, and I appreciate it. And you guys have a good day.